Alessandro De Luca had given one instruction that morning, and only one. No one was to come near his office while the video call with Zurich was live. No cleaning, no deliveries, no footsteps. The housekeeper had been told twice. The doorman downstairs had been told once. Even the maintenance man who serviced the private elevator had received a text at 6 in the morning saying that the 14th floor did not exist between 9 and 10. In Alessandro's world, an instruction was not a request. It was law. He was 38 years old, and for 20 of those years he had run the De Luca empire without a single man daring to raise his voice against him. He owned the tallest penthouse on the Upper East Side, 3 shipping companies on the eastern seaboard, and a chain of laundered restaurants that no accountant in the country could untangle. The call this morning was worth $40 million. A Swiss real estate structure, 3 shell companies, a bank in Zurich that had asked no questions since 1972. The man on the other side of the screen was the kind of investor who counted the silences between sentences. One cough, one shadow across the wall behind Alessandro, and the deal would evaporate like breath on glass. He heard it at the 12th minute, a soft, dragging sound, then silence, then again. Something or someone was moving in the marble hallway outside his office. Alessandro did not turn his head. He kept his gaze fixed on the screen, on the pale, unreadable face of the Zurich banker discussing quarterly liquidity. But his jaw tightened by a single degree, and inside his chest something began to warm the way a blade warms when it is held too close to a flame. The sound came again, closer, rhythmic, deliberate. Everyone inside this penthouse knew that breaking a direct order from Alessandro De Luca was something no sane human being ever did. Someone had broken his order. Someone was going to answer for it the moment this call ended. He finished the meeting with the self-control he had spent 2 decades sharpening. He nodded at the right pauses. He confirmed the wiring schedule. He smiled the small, cold smile that had closed 1,000 deals. Only when the screen went dark did he stand. The anger rose in his chest like heated steel. He crossed to the door with the slow, measured stride of a man who intended to fire someone before the minute was out. He expected to find a cleaner with a broom, a delivery boy on the wrong floor, something small and disposable and easy to erase. He opened the door. Beneath the Italian crystal chandelier, in the exact middle of the polished marble hallway, sat a baby girl. She could not have been more than 8 months old. She wore a pink cotton onesie that had been washed too many times. Her hair was dark and curling, and a single rebellious lock had fallen across her forehead. She was propped on her small hands, her head tilted up, and she was looking directly at him with wide brown eyes that seemed to hold no fear at all. Alessandro De Luca, the man the underworld of 2 boroughs whispered about with lowered voices. The man who had signed execution orders with both his hands. The man who had spent 38 years making sure nothing ever slipped past the wall inside his chest, stood frozen in his own doorway before a creature who could not yet speak a single word. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The baby did not cry. She did not look away. She tilted her head to one side, studied him as if he were the most interesting object she had ever encountered, and then she smiled. It was a small, crooked smile that wrinkled her nose and revealed 2 tiny milk teeth just beginning to break through her lower gum. Then she began to crawl toward him. It was not a coordinated crawl. It was a mixture of dragging her knees and pushing with her palms. Uneven and clumsy, but there was no mistaking her intent. She was coming for him. Alessandro took an instinctive step back. He knew nothing about children. He had never held one in his life. He had never wanted to. Children were chaos. They cried without warning. They needed things a man like him did not know how to give. But she kept coming, and when she reached his shoes, she sat up on the marble floor, tipped her head back to look up at him, and lifted both of her small arms into the air, the universal gesture that means, "Pick me up." "Elena?" he called quietly down the hallway. His voice did not sound like his own. There was no answer. The baby did not lower her arms. She simply waited, her palms open, her eyes patient in a way no adult in his life had ever looked at him. There was no judgment in that gaze. There was no expectation beyond the one written into her outstretched hands. And something in that unconditional look, something in the way this tiny, the defenseless creature had chosen to trust the most dangerous man in New York without knowing, it cracked something. Alessandro De Luca had spent 38 years building brick by brick. He knelt down slowly on the cold marble. He slid his hands beneath her arms, awkward, unpracticed, careful the way a man might handle something made of glass, and he lifted her up. She settled against his chest immediately, as if that were exactly the place she had been trying to reach. Her head rested on his shoulder. One tiny fist closed around the silk of his Italian tie and would not let go. She weighed almost nothing. She was warm, she smelled faintly of talcum powder, and something sweeter he could not name. He stood in the middle of his marble hallway holding a baby, and for the first time in 20 years, Alessandro De Luca did not know what to do next. Then he heard the sound of running footsteps at the far end of the corridor. Elena Rossi came around the corner, her face white as paper, one hand pressed flat against her mouth to keep from crying out. Elena Rossi ran the last few steps of the marble hallway and then stopped short, as if hitting an invisible wall. Her hands began to tremble at her sides. Her eyes were rimmed red. She had been crying somewhere before this, in some corner of the penthouse where he could not see her. When she saw the baby in his arms, a small broken sound escaped her throat before she could catch it. "I am so sorry, Mr. De Luca. I am so sorry." The words came out on top of each other, stumbling. She pressed her palm harder against her mouth, then dropped it and pressed it against her chest instead, as if she could hold her own heart in place. "I only went to the bathroom. 2 minutes. 2 minutes, I swear. When I came back, she was gone from the mat, and I looked in the kitchen first, and then the guest bathroom, and then I heard your voice." She could not finish. She stared at his tie, where a small fist still clung to the silk, and her eyes flooded again. Please, whatever you decide, I will pack my things right now. I will not ask for anything. I will not come back. Only, if it is possible, please do not call anyone before I leave. Please." Alessandro looked down at her. He had expected many things to rise in his chest in this moment. Rage. Cold, clean rage. The kind that made men in his organization apologize for sins they had not yet committed. Contempt. The clean pleasure of dismissing someone for a violation this flagrant. He had fired men from his organization for far less than this. But none of that came. What came was one word, spoken very quietly. "How long?" Elena's head bowed until her chin nearly touched her collarbone. For a long moment she did not answer, and he watched her shoulders shake in a way that had nothing to do with fear of him. 3 months, sir. 3 months. 3 months of a child living in his home without his knowledge. 3 months of a woman carrying 2 lives through his marble doorway at 7 o'clock every morning, while he sipped his espresso and read the Wall Street Journal and never once looked up. He asked the second question in the same quiet voice. "Where?" "The laundry room, sir. She has a little cushion. Some soft toys that do not make sound. I feed her before you wake. I feed her again at noon. She sleeps most of the day. She almost never cries. Only today I think another tooth is coming in." She was restless. And who knew? Elena hesitated. He could see her weighing whether protecting the others would cost her more than she had already lost. "Please, Mr. De Luca. They only stayed silent because they felt sorry for me. They are good people. It is not their fault." "Who, Elena?" She swallowed. "Mr. Raimondo, the doorman, Mrs. Lucia, who cleans the lobby, the delivery boy from the Italian market on Fridays. That is all." Alessandro let the names settle in the quiet. An entire small conspiracy of pity had been operating inside his own building, under his own name. The men and women who greeted him every morning with professional courtesy, who held elevator doors and carried packages and wished him a good day, all of them had known something he had not, and none of them had told him. Anywhere else in his life, that would have been a betrayal punishable in ways Elena did not want to imagine. Standing here in his marble hallway, with a warm, sleeping child breathing softly against his collarbone, he did not feel betrayed. He felt something stranger, something he could not yet name, a kind of embarrassment that he had been so blind, and beneath that, buried deeper, an old cold ache that he had built a house so silent that a baby could live in it for 90 days undetected. He asked the third question, and this one came slower than the others. "Why did you not tell me, Elena?" She looked up at him then. Her eyes were exhausted and honest and completely without hope. "Because you are not the kind of employer a person can tell that to, sir." The sentence landed inside his chest with more weight than he wanted to admit. She had not said it cruelly. She had said it the way a person reports the weather. It was simply true. He looked down at the baby against his shoulder. She was fast asleep now, her mouth slightly open, one small breath at a time. Her fist had not loosened on his tie. He looked at Elena. He looked at the child. He looked back at Elena. And then Alessandro De Luca did something that, 10 minutes ago, he would have sworn on his father's grave he was incapable of doing. "I am not firing you." 3 words. He said them in the same quiet voice he had used for the questions, as if he were only reading a line from a document. But he watched what they did to her, and he understood that in the small country where Elena Rossi lived, those 3 words had just rearranged the map. She stared at him, her mouth opened, then closed. She glanced at the baby against his chest. as though the child might explain a language she could not follow. I do not understand, sir. Please. What did you say? I said, I am not firing you. She still did not move, so he said it a third way, because he understood now that she needed to hear it in the tone that most resembled an order, since orders were the only language this house had ever spoken to her in. Sit down, Elena. In the living room. I am not going to speak to you standing in a hallway. She followed him because she did not know what else to do. He watched her hesitate at the archway of the living room the way a person hesitates at the edge of a place they have only ever cleaned. To sit on the pale gray sofa she had polished every Friday for 3 years seemed a heavier transgression than hiding a child in the laundry room. In the end, she perched on the very edge of a single armchair, her back straight, her hands folded on top of each other in her lap like a child at school. Alessandro sat across from her, still holding the baby. He did not know what else to do with his hands. Tell me, he said. Tell you what, sir? About her father, about your family, about how it is that a woman working in this building could not find $2,800 a month for a nursery. Tell me all of it. She looked at him for a long moment, trying to understand what kind of trap this was. When she finally accepted that it was not a trap at all, only something even more unfamiliar, she began to speak in a low, steady voice, as if she had rehearsed these facts in her head many times, but had never before had a person to say them out loud to. The father of Mia had walked out of the apartment on the same afternoon she had shown him the second pink line on a plastic stick. He had said he was not ready to be a father, that he had plans, that a baby was not part of those plans. He had not called since. She did not know what city he lived in now, and she preferred it that way. Her own parents had died in a car accident on the interstate outside Utica when she was 19. She had no brothers or sisters. There was an aunt somewhere in Naples she had not spoken to since childhood. She had no family in New York. No one to leave the baby with. No one who would even notice if she disappeared from an apartment on a Tuesday night, except perhaps the landlord, who noticed rent. The best nursery within a reasonable subway distance was called Sunny Days. She had visited it once, sat in the small bright office, and looked at the number the director had gently slid across the desk to her. $2,800 a month, more than her entire paycheck. She had smiled politely and walked back out onto the street and cried on the crosstown bus. Alessandro listened. He listened without interrupting, without offering the small murmurs of sympathy other men might have used to fill the spaces. He simply listened, and as he did, an uncomfortable truth began to settle into his ribs like cold water. He had known nothing about this woman, nothing at all. She had cleaned his kitchen for 3 years. She had folded his shirts. She had scrubbed the marble of the hallway where her daughter had crawled tonight. And the only thing he could have told anyone about her, before this evening, was that she arrived at 7:05 every morning instead of 7, as her contract stated. He had noticed the 5 minutes. He had never once thought to ask why. Elena stopped speaking. She looked at him warily, as if bracing. Why are you doing this, sir? He did not have an answer for her. He honestly did not know. He was not a man given to charity, and he was not, by any honest measure of himself, a good man. He had never wanted to be one. The world he had built for himself did not reward goodness, and it punished softness with a precision he had helped design. But when he looked down at the small body sleeping against his shoulder, at the tiny fist still curled around the silk of his tie in a grip a child that age should not have possessed, he understood one thing very clearly. He could not go back to being the man he had been 10 minutes ago. That man had closed a door somewhere in this apartment tonight, and it would not open again. He rose slowly, careful not to wake the baby, and crossed to his study for a moment while Elena waited. He did not know why he needed to be alone for the length of a single breath, only that he did. He opened the top drawer of his desk. Inside, beneath a stack of unopened envelopes, lay a small string of dark, worn olive wood rosary beads, his father's. He had not touched them since the funeral almost 20 years ago. His fingers brushed the smooth wood, just for a moment, then he slid the drawer closed. When he returned to the living room, Elena was still sitting exactly as he had left her, hands folded, spine straight, terrified of moving even her feet. Tomorrow, he said, something is going to change. I do not yet know what, but something has to be different in this house. Do you understand me, Elena? She did not understand. He could see it in her face, but she nodded anyway. Outside the tall windows, the lights of Manhattan blinked on, one apartment at a time. The next morning, Alessandro did not go to the office. He canceled 2 meetings and pushed a third to the following week. Marco Bellini, on the receiving end of the phone call, did not ask why. That was one of the reasons Marco had lasted at Alessandro's side for 15 years. He simply said, understood, and move things on the calendar as if erasing them from stone. At 7:05, the private elevator opened. Elena stepped out with 2 bags on her shoulder, the way she had for 3 years. Alessandro was standing at the far end of the marble hallway, a cup of black coffee in his hand, and for the first time he looked at her the way a man looks at a room he thinks he knows, and suddenly does not. She did not see him at first. She was too focused on being quiet. The large canvas tote he had noticed 1,000 times contained her cleaning uniform, her gloves, a folded apron, and the small kit of polishes she used for the silverware. He knew that bag. He had walked past it 1,000 mornings without a second thought. The second bag was smaller, softer, a pale blue canvas with a strap worn thin at the edges. He had seen it every morning of the last 3 months and had never once wondered what was inside it. Diapers, a tin of formula, a folded muslin cloth, a pacifier on a small clip. The small, ordinary supplies of a life he had never suspected was moving through his apartment. She disappeared into the laundry room for exactly 4 minutes. When she came out, she was already in her apron, hair tied back, and the second bag was gone. He watched her from behind his coffee for the rest of the morning. She did not sing. She did not hum. She did not turn on the small kitchen radio that the previous housekeeper had used to fill the silences of the empty apartment. She moved through his rooms the way a nurse moves through a sleeping ward, opening drawers without a click, setting cups down without a sound, closing doors as though her life depended on the hinges. In 3 years he had never noticed the shape of her silence, because silence in this apartment had always simply been his own. Now he understood it belonged to her as well. It had cost her more. He passed the laundry room door twice that morning without looking in. On the second pass, he did. He had not stepped inside this room in 3 years. It was larger than he remembered. 2 industrial washers, a matching dryer, a wall of white shelves stacked with towels folded with a precision that would have satisfied a hotel manager, bottles of detergent lined up by height. The air smelled faintly of lavender and warm cotton. In the far corner, tucked between the base of the shelving unit and the wall, was a thin foam mat. Pillows had been placed around 3 of its sides so that a small body could not roll off. On the mat lay Mia, asleep on her back with her arms flung above her head like a starfish, her mouth slightly open, a small line of drool tracing the corner of her lip. Elena appeared in the doorway behind him without a sound. She did not speak. She did not defend the room, or the mat, or herself. She simply stood there and waited. Alessandro crouched down slowly, careful not to let his knees crack against the tile. He reached out one finger and touched the tiny bare foot that had escaped from a light muslin blanket. It was warm, the baby's nose wrinkled in her sleep. She did not wake. "How old is she?" he said quietly, though he already knew. 8 months. "Sir, 2 weeks ago, Tuesday." He stayed crouched a moment longer, looking at the way she slept, the complete, unguarded surrender of a creature who did not yet know that the world was ever anything other than safe. Then he stood up and turned away. He was almost through the door when he stopped. "This cannot continue, Elena." He heard the sharp inhale behind him. He heard her fingers close around the doorframe, as if to hold herself up. He knew what she thought he had just said. He knew every meaning she was pouring into those 4 words in the space of a single breath. He did not turn around, because he did not want her to see his face when he finished the sentence. "She deserves more than a mat in a laundry room." He left before she could answer. He worked from his study for the rest of the day. He signed documents without reading them properly. He rescheduled a call with Naples for the 4th time. Twice, without meaning to, he set down his pen and simply listened, as if he might catch the soft sound of a baby breathing on the other side of a closed door. At 6 that evening, Elena stopped in the doorway of the study to say she was leaving. She had Mia against her shoulder now, dressed in a small yellow jacket, with a hood shaped like a duck's head. Mia was awake. She looked at Alessandro from under the yellow hood, blinked once, and then buried her face against her mother's neck out of shyness. "Good night, sir." "Good night, Elena." They were gone. The private elevator hummed once and fell silent. He listened to the apartment settle around him. He walked the length of the marble hallway. He crossed the living room where Elena had sat the night before on the edge of the armchair. He passed the empty kitchen. He passed the laundry room door, now closed, and heard nothing behind it. The silence was the same silence that had lived in this apartment for 3 years. He had always called it peace. Tonight it sounded like something else. He returned to his study, sat down at the desk, and picked up his phone. Marco answered on the second ring. "Marco, I need 3 names by tomorrow morning. The best licensed nurseries within a 2-mile radius of this building. Places with a waiting list I do not need to wait on. Places I would trust with a child." There was the smallest pause on the other end of the line. Marco was a man who had learned in 15 years never to ask a question that had not been invited. But this one was new territory, and he allowed himself the shortest breath. For whom, boss? Alessandro looked at the closed door of his study, and beyond it, at the dark marble hallway, for someone who deserves more than a mat in a laundry room. 3 days passed. Marco brought the 3 names the following morning, printed on a single sheet of paper because he understood that Alessandro preferred paper he could burn. Alessandro read the sheet once, circled the second name, and handed it back. By that afternoon, a woman named Rosa at Sunny Days had received a phone call from a man who spoke with formal courtesy, mentioned the name of a mutual acquaintance on the parish board, and asked whether one particular spot on her waiting list might be reconsidered. By that evening, the spot was reconsidered. On the second day, deliveries began arriving through the service entrance. The doormen carried up boxes without labels. Alessandro received each one at the door himself, which was itself so unusual that the men who had known him for a decade avoided his eyes on the way back to the elevator. On the third day, Alessandro left the office at 4 in the afternoon. He had not left an office at 4 in the afternoon in perhaps 10 years. The private elevator opened onto his marble hallway a little after 4:30. He stepped out, expecting silence. What he found instead was Elena, standing perfectly still at the doorway of the small room beside the kitchen, the room he had kept locked for 3 years, with her hand pressed against the doorframe as though she needed it to keep her upright. She did not hear him approach. She was looking into the room. Alessandro stopped a few feet behind her and looked as well. The room was no longer empty. The bare parquet floor had been covered by a thick foam mat in soft, muted colors, patterned with small clouds. Along one wall stood a portable crib in pale white wood, the netting turned back and ready. Near the window, framed by afternoon light, sat a low rocking chair with a cream cushion. A small basket of new picture books had been placed within easy reach of it. In one corner stood a shelf of soft toys, a giraffe with long dangling legs, a rabbit in a knitted sweater, a family of ducks tied together with ribbon, a miniature wooden pushcart of blocks weighted by the mat as if a child had just stepped away from it for a moment. And in the very center of the crib, propped carefully upright against a folded blanket, sat a plush elephant. He was pale gray. He was slightly smaller than the child he was waiting for. His trunk curled upward in the classic gesture of good luck, and his ears were oversized and soft in the way that suggested he had been chosen carefully by someone who knew that 8-month-old fingers grip everything by the ears first. Alessandro had ordered the elephant himself. It had been the only item on the list he did not delegate. Elena's shoulders began to shake before her face did. "Mr. DeLuca, sir, I cannot accept this." She turned toward him at last, her hand still braced against the doorframe as if she might otherwise fall. Tears slid down her cheeks in silence. Behind her legs, Mia had crawled up and was hanging onto the hem of her mother's skirt with one small fist, staring wide-eyed into the strange bright room she was not yet allowed to enter. This is too much. I cannot pay you back for this. I do not know how to, Elena." He said her name, the way a man closes a door quietly. "This is not for you. This is for her." She opened her mouth, then closed it. He walked past her into the room and knelt beside the mat. He did not look at her while he spoke, because he understood that this was easier for both of them if he did not. "There is a nursery 10 minutes from here. It is called Sunny Days. I have already spoken with the director. She has a spot for Mia beginning Wednesday. The program has a scholarship for working mothers. You will be one of them. The rest of the difference I am handling from my side, and I do not want to hear about it again." He turned the plush elephant carefully, so that its face pointed toward the doorway. "Beginning next month, your salary is increased by 30%. That should cover what the scholarship does not, and leave you enough that you never again decide between rent and formula. If your rent goes up next year, you will tell me, and it will be handled. This is not a discussion, this is a decision. I have already made it." Elena made a small broken sound in her throat. "Why, sir? Why are you doing this?" He rose slowly and looked at her. He had prepared no speech. He was not a man who prepared speeches for a housekeeper. So he told her the only honest sentence he had. "Because I am able to." She did not answer that. She only wiped her face with the back of her wrist, the way she wiped counters, quick and businesslike, as if she treated her own tears as a small mess to be cleaned, they might obey her. He reached down and gently unhooked Mia's small fingers from her mother's skirt. "May I?" Elena nodded, unable to speak. He carried the baby into the room and set her carefully in the middle of the foam mat. For a heartbeat, Mia sat very still, taking in the new colors, the new smells, the new soft weight beneath her palms. Then her eyes fell on the plush elephant in the crib. Her whole face lit up, She crawled across the mat without hesitation, hauled herself up against the low bars of the crib, and reached one determined hand between them. She could not quite grab the elephant. She tried again. On the third try, one small fist closed around a floppy gray ear. Alessandro reached in, lifted the elephant out, and placed it in her arms. She hugged it against her chest with both hands, and began to laugh an open, uncomplicated laugh that showed both of her tiny milk teeth and filled the room with a sound it had been built to hold and had never yet held. Alessandro stood very still. Something inside his chest cracked a little further, along the same fault line the child had opened 3 nights ago in his hallway. He did not know how much more it could give before something behind it broke free entirely. Elena had come to stand in the doorway beside him. She was not crying anymore. She was watching her daughter and the elephant and the man who had bought it, and there was an expression on her face that Alessandro did not know how to read. "Mr. De Luca," she said quietly. "Alessandro," she hesitated. "Alessandro, why are you being so good to us?" He looked at Mia. The baby was rocking the elephant against her cheek now, murmuring some small nonsense syllable that seemed to be its name. He opened his mouth to answer. Nothing came out. He genuinely did not know. He had never in his life done a thing like this, and he could not have explained to Elena, or to himself, or to any of the men who worked for him, why he was doing it now. The only truth he had was that he did not want to stop, so he said nothing at all. He simply stayed where he was, watching a child he barely knew fall in love with a gray plush elephant on a floor he had kept locked for 3 years, and he understood quietly, without ceremony, that some doors, once opened, do not close again. Wednesday morning came in gray and mild, the kind of city morning that seemed to hold its breath between summer and fall. Elena arrived at 7:05, as she always had, but this time she did not go straight to the laundry room. She stood for a moment in the hallway, holding Mia against her hip in a small blue coat and matching hat, and looked around as if she had never quite seen this apartment before. She was wearing her best blouse. Alessandro noticed it the moment she stepped out of the elevator. It was white cotton, ironed with painful precision, the collar buttoned to the top. He also noticed that it was older than anything hanging in his own closet. There was a very faint stain near the second button that a person who cared could no longer wash out. She had ironed the shirt around that stain the way she had ironed around everything difficult in her life. She carried Mia to the low table in the entry hall and began to fasten the small buttons on the baby's coat with hands that would not stop trembling. On the third button she gave up trying to steady her fingers and let herself simply breathe for a moment. Alessandro walked out of his study with his car keys in his hand. "I will drive you." She looked up sharply. "Sir Alessandro, no, please. I can take the train. It is only a few stops. I do not want to take your time. I have no meetings this morning." It was not true. He had 2. He had cancelled them both the night before, without giving Marco an explanation. Marco had said, "Understood," in the flat voice he used when he understood nothing at all. "Come, it is faster." She did not argue again. She could not tell whether refusing him twice would offend him, and she was not in a condition today to risk finding out. Downstairs in the garage, his black sedan waited under the fluorescent light. Beside the rear passenger door, strapped tightly into the middle of the back seat, was a small child's car seat in charcoal gray, still faintly smelling of the packaging it had been unwrapped from the night before. Elena stopped short at the sight of it. Where did that come from?" "I installed it last night," he said, opening the rear door. He did not tell her that the installation had taken him 40 minutes and 3 viewings of a video made by a very patient woman on the internet. He did not tell her that Marco had come down to the garage at 11 at night looking for him, had seen him crouched in the back of the sedan tightening a strap, and had simply set down the paperwork he had brought, turned around, and walked back to the elevator without saying a single word. Elena buckled Mia into the seat with careful, disbelieving hands. Mia thought the whole affair was a wonderful game and grabbed at the buckle with both fists, laughing. Alessandro drove. He drove more slowly than he had driven anywhere in a decade. He took the corners as if he were transporting something priceless and breakable, which in fact he was. Elena sat in the passenger seat with her hands folded rigidly in her lap and stared out the window and did not speak, because if she opened her mouth she was going to cry. Sunny days occupied the ground floor of a narrow limestone building on a quiet cross street. The bright yellow sign above the door was hand-painted, not printed. Through the window one could see small tables and low shelves and, at this hour, a semicircle of chairs and other children already gathering for the morning song. Rosa met them at the door. She was perhaps 60 years old, small and round, with iron gray hair pinned up in a loose knot and reading glasses on a chain around her neck. When she saw Mia in Elena's arms, her face opened into a smile of the kind that could only be earned across many decades of children. "So this is our little Mia," she said in the warm, slightly sing-song English of a woman whose first language had been the Italian of a village outside Palermo. "Buongiorno, tesoro mio. Come and see what we have for you today." She held out her hands. Elena did not move. For a long, quiet moment, Elena simply held her daughter tighter against her chest, and it was clear that this was the first morning in 8 months and 2 weeks that she had willingly considered handing this baby to a stranger. Alessandro stood a step behind her. He did not know what to do with his hands. He had held boardrooms of hostile men without moving a finger, and now his own hands were foreign objects hanging at his sides. In the end, he lifted one of them and placed it, very lightly, on Elena's shoulder. It was the first time he had touched her at all, in 3 years, without a barrier of professional distance between them. She did not flinch. She closed her eyes for a heartbeat, drew in a breath that was more shudder than air, and then handed Mia gently over to Rosa. Mia looked at the older woman, considered her seriously, reached out and grabbed the reading glasses on their chain, and burst into a delighted giggle. Rosa laughed. Elena made a sound halfway between a laugh and a sob and pressed her fingers hard against her mouth. "She will be perfectly fine, Cara," Rosa said gently. "You come back at 4. She will have painted something, probably her face." They walked back to the car in silence. Elena did not look back. He understood without being told that she could not. He held the passenger door open for her. She sat down carefully, folded her hands again in her lap, and did not speak for the entire First Avenue. At the second traffic light, without turning to look at him, she said very quietly, "Thank you, Alessandro." "No, sir. No, Mr. De Luca. No, signora." Only his name, spoken in a voice that had cracked halfway through it. He did not answer. The light turned green. He eased the sedan forward, and as he drove the rest of the way back to the penthouse through the crosstown traffic, past the delicatessen where he never stopped, past the small park where he had never once walked, Alessandro De Luca kept his eyes on the road and, without meaning to, smiled quietly to himself for the length of 35 blocks. 3 weeks slid past almost without his noticing. Mia settled into sunny days the way she had settled into everything so far in her short life, with a kind of stubborn cheerfulness that seemed to reorganize the world around her. Rosa reported that she was already the loudest laugher in the 8-month room. She had painted her own face twice. She had a favorite corner near the window. She had learned to clap her hands whenever anyone sang, whether or not there was a song, and Alessandro De Luca had, without discussing it with anyone, begun to leave his office at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. He had not left an office at 5 o'clock in the afternoon in 20 years. Marco Bellini noticed the first time. He said nothing. He noticed the second time. He said nothing. By the 4th time, he stopped scheduling meetings after 4:30 and quietly rearranged the calendars of everyone who reported to Alessandro, so that no one would ever again be left standing in a hallway waiting for the boss who had, without warning, gone home. Marco was a man who had learned very early in his career that some questions did not deserve to be asked. He simply moved the world around Alessandro's absence and did not comment. Alessandro arrived back at the penthouse before Elena and Mia now, every day. Just for the 30 minutes he could squeeze between 5:30 and 6, when Elena finished cleaning and prepared to take the baby home. 30 minutes, that was all. It became the most valuable half hour of his day. In those 30 minutes he learned things about himself he had never suspected. He learned that a baby's laugh, applied directly to the surface of a marble living room, sounded like an entirely different kind of music than anything he had ever paid a violinist to play. He learned that Mia preferred to be lifted from beneath the arms and slightly to the left, and that if he tilted her a fraction too far, she would frown in a small, dignified way that reminded him inexplicably of his mother. He learned that she loved the sound of his voice when he read words she did not understand, and that she especially loved when he spoke Italian, and would sometimes touch his lips with 2 curious fingers to see where the sound was coming from. He learned other things in secret. In the top drawer of the desk in his private study, beside the olive wood rosary he had not touched in decades, there now lay an iPad. On the iPad lived a copy of a book called What to Expect, the First Year, and beside it, saved in a folder labeled only M, were videos on how to warm a bottle of formula to exactly the right temperature by testing a drop on the inside of one's wrist, on how to burp an infant without breaking her small back, on how to distinguish the sleepy cry from the hungry cry, from the wet cry, from the tooth cry. He read the book at night when the apartment was empty. He watched the videos with the sound low, as if he were consuming something scandalous. One afternoon, Bruno Ricci, the head of his security detail, a man built like a refrigerator, and possessed of a face that had frightened, seasoned killers into apology, walked into the office to deliver a folder and glanced, purely by accident, at the boss's computer monitor. Displayed on the screen, in a browser window Alessandro had not fully closed, were the words, "How to talk to an 8-month-old baby." Bruno set down the folder with the same expressionless efficiency he used for everything else. He looked at the floor. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at a point on the wall approximately 2 inches above the boss's head. The Chicago file. "Sir, as requested." "Thank you, Bruno." "Anything else, sir?" "No." Bruno turned and left the office. In the hallway outside, without changing his expression at any point, he crossed himself. Elena began to stay longer in the evenings. At first only by 10 minutes, then 20. She would finish her work, gather Mia from the nursery downstairs, where Rosa had begun to leave her when Alessandro came home early, and linger in the kitchen for reasons neither of them named. It was easier to change a diaper here than on the subway. Mia liked the light in the kitchen. Certainly it had nothing to do with the man reading the newspaper at the far counter. One Thursday she cooked. It was nothing elaborate. Spaghetti with tomato sauce, a little garlic, basil torn from the small plant she had brought in a paper cup 2 weeks ago and quietly placed on the window ledge above the sink. She asked his permission before she opened the pantry, and he simply nodded without looking up from his paper, as if she had asked permission to breathe. 20 minutes later, the whole apartment smelled of a home. Alessandro sat down at the marble table in the kitchen. He had bought that table 3 years ago from a workshop in Carrara, imported at considerable expense, along with the chairs that matched it. It could seat 8. He had never once eaten a meal at it. He had never once sat at it at all. It had lived in his kitchen as a piece of very expensive sculpture, kept polished by the same woman who now set a plate of pasta in front of him without ceremony. Mia sat in a new high chair between them, thumping a plastic spoon against the tray in a rhythm known only to herself, and occasionally shouting at the ceiling for reasons no one understood. Elena leaned over once to wipe sauce from the baby's cheek and, in doing so, laughed. Alessandro laughed too. It was not a loud laugh. It was the kind of laugh a man learns to keep small when he has spent 20 years hiding what he feels, but it was a laugh, and it came out of him without permission. And when it did, Elena looked up at him quickly, her fork halfway to her mouth. She realized, in that moment, that this was the first time in 3 years she had ever heard him laugh. She did not say so. She only lowered her eyes back to her plate and smiled to herself, and reached out to steady the spoon in Mia's hand. They finished the pasta slowly. Alessandro cleared his own plate to the sink, which caused Elena to freeze in the middle of picking up hers and stare at him as though he had just committed a small crime. He rinsed both plates. He said nothing about it. At 6:45, Elena bundled Mia into her small coat and hat. He walked them to the private elevator. Mia waved at him over Elena's shoulder as the doors closed, a small, open and closing wave with all 4 fingers at once, and then they were gone. The apartment settled around him again, the dishes drained by the sink, the marble table still faintly warm where 3 people had sat, the high chair pushed neatly against the wall. The silence returned. It was the same silence that had lived in this penthouse for 3 years. He had always called it peace. Tonight, for the first time, he stood in the middle of his kitchen and understood that he did not want it back. Friday. The city was warm and gray, the kind of low sky that pressed against the tall windows of the penthouse without ever fully deciding to rain. Alessandro left the office at 4:30, which was earlier than 5, which was already earlier than he had ever left in his life. Marco Bellini watched him go from a doorway across the corridor, said nothing, and gently canceled a call to Buenos Aires. Alessandro opened the door of the penthouse at 5:10, and heard the crying before he had taken off his coat. It was not a small cry. It was the sustained, high, exhausted cry of a small human being who had already been at it a very long time and had every intention of continuing. It filled the marble hallway. It bounced off the crystal chandelier. It made the apartment sound, for one strange moment, like a place where an actual life was being lived. He walked quickly toward the living room. Elena was standing in the middle of the room, bouncing Mia gently against her shoulder, her face flushed and drawn. Her hair had come loose from the small clip she wore at the back of her head. There were damp patches on the front of her blouse where the baby had cried into it. She looked up when he came in, and he saw immediately how close she was to breaking. "I am so sorry," she said, before he could ask. "She has been like this for almost 2 hours. It is another tooth. I have tried everything I know, sir. The gel, the cold ring from the freezer, the rocking." I sang. How long since you sat down, Elena?" She blinked at him. "I do not know." Mia lifted her small red face from her mother's shoulder. saw Alessandro, and did the one thing she always did when she saw him. She reached for him, both arms. Even through her tears, even in the middle of pain she could not name, she stretched out her hands. Alessandro crossed the room in 3 steps. "May I?" Elena nodded. She could not manage words. He took the baby from her carefully. Mia burrowed instantly against his neck, pressed her hot small face into the hollow beneath his jaw, and fastened one determined fist into the collar of his shirt. She did not stop crying, but the tone changed, dropped half an octave, softened at the edges. She had made a decision about where she wanted to be, and now that she was there, only the pain itself remained. He began to walk. He walked her slowly along the length of the living room, past the tall windows, past the pale gray sofa, past the fireplace no one ever lit. He walked her in a small, steady arc, bouncing very slightly at each step, and after a moment, without deciding to, he began to sing. It was in Italian. He had not known he still knew the words. It was a lullaby his mother had sung to him almost 40 years ago in a small kitchen in Brooklyn, at a table with a plastic tablecloth, when he had scraped his knee or been frightened by thunder or simply refused to sleep. She had died before he turned 18. He had not thought of that lullaby in the whole of his adult life. It came out of him now, low and rough and slightly off-key, the way a song comes out of a man who has never sung it aloud in front of another human being. Mia listened. Somewhere in the second verse, her crying began to break apart. It came in shorter bursts. It dissolved into hiccups. She lifted her head once, blinked at him with her wet eyes, and pressed her face back into his neck. The small fist in his collar loosened by a single knuckle. He kept walking. He kept singing. By the end of the 3rd verse, the crying had stopped altogether. By the end of the 4th, her breathing had begun to slow, deepening into the long, even rhythm of a child who has finally accepted the surrender of sleep. Her weight against his chest grew heavier, denser, until the entire small body seemed to melt into him, as if she had been poured there. He did not stop walking. He was afraid the moment he stood still, she would wake. He walked for 15 minutes. There are moments in a man's life when the border between who he has been and who he might yet become is drawn no thicker than the breath of a sleeping child. Alessandro De Luca stood at that border for 7 seconds, holding a creature who shared none of his blood, and understood without any argument left in him that nothing, not the empire he had inherited, not the power he had built, not one single thing he had ever fought to take from another man mattered more, in that 7 seconds, than not waking her. He turned finally toward the sofa. Elena had lowered herself onto the very edge of it. She was watching him with an expression he had never seen on her face before, the expression of a woman who had forgotten, for a moment, to be afraid of the room she was sitting in. She whispered, "Are you a magician?" He looked down at the small, dark head tucked beneath his jaw. He shook his head very slightly, so as not to disturb her. "No," he whispered back. "I was only patient." He crossed to the sofa and lowered himself onto it beside Elena. Mia did not stir. Her small fist stayed closed on his collar. Her breath went on, warm and even, against the hollow of his throat. For a long moment, none of them moved. Outside the windows, the gray afternoon was beginning to soften into evening. A single lamp burned in the corner. The apartment was quiet in a way it had never been quiet before. Not the polished, empty quiet of the last 20 years, but a full, breathing quiet. The quiet of 3 people who had, without meaning to, come to rest in the same room. Elena tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Her hands, which had been shaking for 2 hours, had stopped shaking. Neither of them spoke. They simply sat there in the low lamplight, a man on one end of the sofa and a woman on the other, and between them, warm and asleep and utterly at peace, a small child breathing. From the doorway, if anyone had passed by, they would have looked. For the first time in the 20 years, the marble hallway had stood, unmistakably like a family. They did not move from the sofa for a long time. When Alessandro finally spoke, his voice was low enough not to disturb the small, warm body against his chest. "If you take her home now, she will wake in the taxi. She will not sleep again tonight, Elena. Neither will you." Elena looked at him. She looked at Mia. She looked at the dark windows and at her own hands in her lap. "Stay," he said. "There are 3 guest rooms in this apartment that have never held a person. I have shirts and a robe you can borrow. Tomorrow is Saturday. There is no reason to move her." She hesitated. He watched her weigh 100 things at once: propriety, safety, the strange country she had already been walking through for 3 weeks, and then he watched her decide. "All right," she whispered. "Thank you." They carried Mia together to the small room beside the kitchen. Alessandro lowered her into the portable crib beside the gray plush elephant, which she found by touch even in her sleep and pulled against her cheek without opening her eyes. Elena tucked the muslin blanket around her, kissed her forehead, and stood a long moment looking down at her before she turned away. She showered in the guest bath. He left a folded white cotton shirt on the bed for her, an old one he no longer wore. When she came out, damp-haired and barefoot, wearing the shirt that reached the middle of her thighs, he was already in the kitchen with the kettle on. He handed her a cup of tea without ceremony, chamomile. He had bought the box a year ago for reasons he could no longer remember. She took it with both hands, as if the warmth mattered more than the drink. They sat down at the marble table together. It was almost midnight. For a while neither of them spoke. The apartment was full of the small mechanical sounds a building makes at night, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the soft click of the heating, a distant elevator sighing to a stop 3 floors below. Elena looked into her tea. Alessandro looked at his hands. Then she asked him the question that no one had ever asked him. "Alessandro, why have you never had a family?" He did not answer immediately. He turned the cup slowly on its saucer. He did not look at her while he began, because that would have been harder. There was someone, a long time ago. I was 24. Her name was Valeria. He said the name carefully, the way one takes a photograph out of a drawer and sets it down on a table. We were together for 3 years. She wanted to marry. She wanted children. She wanted the ordinary things, a house somewhere with a garden, Sunday lunches, an argument now and then about who forgot the milk. She was patient with me for a long time. She was more patient than I deserved. He turned the cup another quarter turn. I told her I was not ready. I told her I needed to build something first, that after the empire was in my hands there would be time for the rest. She waited 1 year, then another. In the end she gave me a choice. She was gentle even about that. "And you chose the empire," Elena said quietly. "I chose the empire." He allowed himself a small, dry smile at his own cup. She married a literature teacher 2 years later. She lives now in a small town in Vermont. She has 3 children. I saw a photograph of her once on the internet. By accident. She looked happy in a way I would not have known how to make her look. Elena did not say anything. She simply listened, the way one listens when one understands that the person speaking has not said any of this aloud before. "I have a ring somewhere," he added, almost against his own will. "It belonged to my mother. It is in a safe behind a painting in my office. 20 years it has been there, since she died. I do not know why I have kept it. I have never taken it out." He touched the rim of his cup with one finger and let the silence rest. "And you?" he said finally. "Mia's father. You have never told me his name." Elena did not tell him the name. She only told him what he had done. She told him about the plastic stick with 2 pink lines, about walking out of the drugstore and calling him from the corner because she could not wait, about the way he had come home that evening, sat down on the edge of the bed, listened to her without looking up, and then stood, picked up the sports bag he had already packed that morning for reasons she had not yet understood, and walked out of the apartment door. He had not called since. He had not seen his daughter. He did not, so far as Elena knew, understand that his daughter had 2 teeth now, or that she liked plush elephants, or that she was alive. "I lived in my car for almost 6 months, she said. So quietly Alessandro almost did not hear it. "In the 2nd month I found a woman in a laundromat who told me about a family in Queens who needed someone to clean. That was my first job. I still send her a card at Christmas." Alessandro's hands closed slowly around his cup. His knuckles went white. He did not trust his voice for a long moment. When he spoke, it came out lower than he intended. "A man who abandons his own child does not deserve to be called a father, Elena. Mia will be better in every possible way for growing up without him. Do not, ever, teach her to want him." Elena looked up at him then. Her eyes were wet, but she did not blink. She only looked at him for a long, still moment across the marble table, as if she were trying to memorize his face for reasons she did not yet want to name. "Alessandro," she said. That was all, just his name, in a voice that was somehow both tired and steady. He understood, in the space between one breath and the next, that something inside this kitchen had just changed permanently, and that neither of them would ever again be able to sit at this table quite the same way they had 10 minutes ago. Outside, above the city, a first slow rain had begun to fall. Alessandro woke earlier than usual. It was still just before 7. The rain from the night had washed the sky clean, and a low golden light was falling through the tall windows of the master bedroom in the particular way it fell only in the first hour of a Saturday. He lay for a moment on his back, listening. Somewhere in the apartment, a woman was laughing. He had lived in this penthouse for 6 years. and in all 6 of those years no one had ever laughed in it before 6 weeks ago. The sound was small, private, familiar in a way he could not yet name. He got up quietly, pulled on a dark cotton robe, and walked barefoot down the marble hallway. He stopped in the doorway of the kitchen. Elena was standing at the stove with her back half turned to him. She was wearing his white cotton shirt from the night before, sleeves rolled to her elbows, hair loose around her shoulders. She was cracking eggs into a pan and humming a low, half-remembered Italian song under her breath. And every so often she turned her head to make a small face at Mia, who was strapped into the new high chair beside the marble table. Mia was slapping both hands flat against the tray in a private percussion concert of her own. Every third slap she made a joyous, wordless shout at the ceiling, as if the ceiling were personally responsible for the noise. When Elena leaned over and pressed her nose against her daughter's, Mia squealed with laughter and grabbed a fistful of her mother's hair. The morning light poured through the window above the sink and set fire to the whole scene: the white shirt, the loose hair, the tiny fists, the 2 dark heads bent together in the yellow warmth of it. Alessandro stood in the doorway and did not move. He had faced men across tables in 3 countries. He had signed documents that made and unmade fortunes. Nothing in his life had prepared him for the simple, unarmed thing of standing in a doorway at 7 o'clock in the morning and watching a woman make eggs for a child that was not his. He walked into the kitchen. Mia saw him and let out a shriek of pure delight, throwing both arms into the air. Without thinking, without deciding, Alessandro bent down and pressed a light kiss to the soft, dark hair on the top of her head. He straightened up. He met Elena's eyes across the marble counter, and only then did he understand what he had just done. He stopped. He set one hand on the back of the high chair as though he needed something to hold. "I am sorry, Elena. I did not mean to, I should not have. It is all right." Her voice was very quiet. "She loves you." A small breath. "And so do I," he thought, for a long, clean second, that his heart had actually stopped inside his chest. He crossed the small distance between them slowly, because his legs did not entirely believe what his ears had just heard. He raised his hand and laid it very carefully against her cheek. Her skin was warm from the stove. She did not move. "Elena." He said her name the way a man says something he has been carrying under his tongue for weeks without permission to release. "I think about you both all day. In meetings, in the car, in the middle of sentences that have nothing to do with you. I leave rooms full of important men because I want to be back here in time to see her before you take her home. 6 weeks ago this apartment was a place I owned. Now it is the only place I want to be. I did not know that could happen to a man. I certainly did not know it could happen to me." Elena's eyes had begun to shine. She did not blink. "I love Mia," he said. "I love her the way I would love a daughter of my own. And I love you, Elena. I have never used those words to anyone in my life. I did not know I still had them." A tear broke over her lower lashes and slid down into the corner of her mouth. She caught it with the back of her wrist. "I am so frightened, Alessandro." "Of what?" "That this is a phase. That in a month, or 6 months, you will wake up and remember who you are, and I will not survive it a second time. I do not think I could." He shook his head, very slowly, without looking away from her. "This is not a phase, Elena. This is the most permanent thing I have ever felt in my life. I know because everything before you was temporary and I called it real, and everything since you has been real and I have been afraid to call it that. I am not afraid anymore." He waited a heartbeat. "I am not going to change my mind." She stepped forward first, or perhaps he did. Neither of them was ever quite sure afterward. He bent his head, and she rose slightly onto her toes, and they kissed for the first time across the corner of the marble table, quietly, carefully, the way 2 people kiss who have understood for weeks that the moment was coming and have both been afraid of it. Mia, 2 feet away in her high chair, banged her palms against the tray in enthusiastic approval and shouted something that might have been laughter and might have been a small, unformed word. They broke apart, smiling, foreheads pressed together, both slightly out of breath. "The eggs," Elena whispered. "They are burning." "I know." Neither of them moved. Somewhere below, on the far side of a wet street, engine idling low against the morning curb, a black BMW with tinted windows sat in a legal parking space it had already been occupying for 18 straight hours. Behind the wheel, a man with a small notebook wrote down a time, without ever taking his eyes from the front entrance of the building. 2 weeks slipped past like a dream that refused to end. Elena and Mia began to stay more nights than they went home. It was not decided in any formal way. It simply happened, the way a river changes course when the old bed can no longer hold it. On the first Sunday, Elena had gone back to her tiny apartment in Queens to pack a small bag of clothes. On the second, she had come back with a larger one. By the end of the second week, 3 of her dresses were hanging quietly in a corner of Alessandro's walk-in closet, and a small bottle of her almond hand cream had appeared on the marble edge of the bathroom sink. Mia now had her own crib in the room beside the master bedroom, a proper wooden one, delivered on a Tuesday morning by 2 men in white gloves. Alessandro had helped assemble it himself. He had needed almost no video this time. The plush gray elephant rode with her from room to room. It never left her hand for long. Alessandro changed. Marco Bellini was the first to see it, because Marco was paid, in effect, to see it. The boss smiled more. He shouted less. He decided faster. Documents that had once lingered on his desk for 3 days were now signed and returned within an hour. He was patient with waiters. He remembered to ask his driver about his son. Twice in 1 week he thanked someone for something small, unprompted, without appearing to notice that he had done it. He did not soften. That was the part that startled Marco most. 2 suppliers, mistaking the smiling as weakness, tried in the first week to renegotiate old terms. Alessandro shut them down in half the time it would have taken him a month ago, and with an efficiency so cold that both men afterward apologized in writing. He was not gentler. He simply had reasons now, where before he had only appetite. Bruno Ricci noticed something else. Bruno noticed that the boss had begun to ask, every evening at exactly 6:15, whether Elena and Mia had returned safely from the nursery, and that he waited to sit down until they had. Bruno noticed that the boss's eyes swept the street differently now on the way to the car. On the 4th day of the second week, Bruno requested authorization to double the number of cameras around Sunny Days and along the 2 blocks approaching it. Alessandro did not ask why. He simply signed. Bruno did not ask why either. The following Thursday, in a small closed room on the top floor of a townhouse 3 blocks from the penthouse, Marco Bellini sat down across a table from Alessandro De Luca for a meeting that had nothing to do with business. You need to marry her, Alessandro. Alessandro did not look up from the espresso he was turning slowly in its saucer. I have thought about it. Think about it faster, Marco. Anyone who has been watching you for 6 weeks, boss, already understands how much that woman matters to you, and there are people who have been watching you for longer than 6 weeks. I do not need to remind you of that. If she is going to be in your life, and I understand that she needs to be in your life inside a wall, not outside of one. A wife has protections. In every family we know. A girlfriend does not. Alessandro was silent for a long moment. Then he said, without looking up, You have never given me romantic advice before, Marco. This is not romantic advice, boss. This is the only kind I am qualified to give. Alessandro allowed himself a very small smile. He looked up. I will handle it. When? Soon. Marco nodded once, satisfied. He did not press further. He had known Alessandro De Luca long enough to know when a matter had been moved from one column of the mind to another, and this one had just been moved. That night, after Elena had put Mia down and taken the master bathroom for a long, quiet shower, Alessandro walked into his private office and closed the door behind him. He turned on only the small lamp on the desk. He crossed to the far wall, took down the heavy oil painting that hung there, a dark seascape his mother had loved, and pressed his palm to the panel of steel behind it. The safe opened with the small mechanical sigh of a door that had not been asked to move in a long time. Inside were the things a man in his position kept in a safe. Passports, loose currency in 3 colors, a single black notebook whose contents he had never permitted anyone else to see, and, at the very back, tucked into a small square velvet box that had lost most of its nap over the years, a ring. He lifted the box out slowly. He opened it under the lamp. The band was silver, thin, faintly darkened at the edges from decades of stillness. The diamond in its center was small. His father had been a proud man, but never a rich one when he bought it, but it was cut with an old, patient clarity, and even under the yellow desk lamp it caught the light and held it as if a very small piece of the sky had been trapped there in 1953. His mother had worn it until the day she died. She had asked, at the very end, for it to be taken off her hand and given to him. She had said, in the last complete sentence of her life, for whoever teaches you to love again, mio caro. He had put it in the safe the day of her funeral. He had not opened the box since. He stood at his desk for a long time with the ring in the flat of his palm, weighing not the metal but the 20 years of silence attached to it. Somewhere behind him, down the hall, Elena laughed softly at something Mia had said in her sleep. He closed the box. He did not put it back in the safe. He slid it into the top drawer of his desk instead, beside the olive wood rosary of his father, so that the 2 of them would rest side by side, waiting for whatever came next. He did not know how little time was left. That same night, 11 blocks north, in a penthouse whose windows also faced the East River, another man sat at a leather desk under a green banker's lamp. In front of him lay a large black album, spiral-bound, of the kind photographers used to store contact sheets. He turned the pages one at a time, slowly, without hurry. On each page were photographs. A dark-haired woman leaving a limestone nursery with a small child on her hip. The same woman carrying grocery bags into the private garage of a building on the Upper East Side. Alessandro De Luca, at the wheel of a black sedan, driving that same woman and that same child through morning traffic on 3rd Avenue. Alessandro De Luca opening a car door for her. Alessandro De Luca laying his hand, without any hurry at all, against her lower back as they walked into a building together. The man at the desk paused at that last photograph. He studied it for a long, slow moment. Then he began, very quietly, to laugh. Elena saw the car for the first time on a Tuesday morning. It was just before 9. She had walked Shmia the last block herself, holding a small warm hand inside her own, because Mia had recently decided that being carried was for babies and she was no longer a baby. She had stopped at the corner opposite Sunny Days to wait for the light, and that was when she noticed it. A black BMW, tinted windows, parked directly across from the nursery, in front of a hydrant it should not have been parked in front of. She thought, at first, that she was imagining it. New York was full of black cars with tinted windows. Half the men in the finance towers rode in them. She dismissed the thought before it fully formed, crossed the street with Mia, and delivered her to Rosa with the usual small kiss on the forehead. The next morning, the car was there again. Same spot, same hydrant, same tinted windows. Elena walked past it more slowly this time. She tried to look without appearing to look. She could see nothing behind the glass, only her own reflection, holding the small hand of a child in a red coat. On the 3rd morning, when she rounded the corner and saw the same car in exactly the same place for the 3rd time, something small and cold moved down the length of her spine. She waited until Mia was safely inside the classroom. Then she went and knocked on the door of Rosa's small office. "Rosa, may I speak to you?" Rosa took one look at her face, closed the door, and sat her down in the small chair opposite her desk. Elena told her. Quietly, without dramatics, 3 mornings, same car, same spot, same feeling in her stomach. Rosa did not laugh at her. Rosa did not tell her she was tired, or worried, or imagining things. Rosa reached across the desk, picked up her phone, and dialed a number that she had kept written on a card inside her top drawer since the day Alessandro De Luca had first walked into this nursery. Only in an emergency, he had said. Rosa had decided this was an emergency. Bruno Ricci arrived in 40 minutes. He did not come alone, but he came in a way that no one on the street would have identified as an arrival. 2 men walked the block on foot. A car circled once. Bruno himself entered through the side door of the nursery as if he were an insurance inspector, complete with a leather folder under one arm. He spoke to Rosa for less than a minute. He spoke to Elena for less than a minute after that. "Do not go outside, Mrs. Rossi. Do not stand near the window. If you have to walk to the bathroom, walk on the far side of the corridor." He left through the same door. 5 minutes later, from a parked position half a block down, he took a photograph of the license plate of the black BMW through a small hole in a takeaway coffee cup lid. He sent the photograph to Marco Bellini. 2 hours later, the results came back. The car was registered to a shell corporation. The shell corporation was registered to a management company. The management company was registered to a law firm on Madison Avenue. The law firm had, for the past 15 years, done work almost exclusively for one client, the Romano family. Alessandro was in a meeting when Marco walked into his office without knocking and closed the door. Marco did not need to say anything. Alessandro read his face, cleared the room in a single sentence, and gestured Marco to the desk. Marco set his phone down on the leather blotter with the photograph of the BMW's plate on the screen. Beneath it, in Marco's clean handwriting, on a small folded piece of paper, Romano. Alessandro looked at the paper for a long moment. He did not move. The De Luca and Romano families had circled each other on the eastern seaboard for 15 years. There had been no open war. There had also been no real peace. It was the kind of quiet that existed only because both sides had, so far, calculated the price of noise to be higher than the profit of it. Vincent Romano, the head of the family, a man Alessandro had met exactly twice. Both times at funerals had a long memory and a longer patience. Alessandro folded the piece of paper slowly. He tucked it inside the breast pocket of his jacket. "Bring Elena to me. Now." Have someone else pick up Mia from the nursery at 4. Not you, not Bruno. Someone from the second circle, someone whose face has never been photographed. Marco nodded once, and was already reaching for his phone before he had left the room. Elena arrived 20 minutes later. Bruno walked her into the private office himself, one hand steady at her elbow, and then left without a word. She stood in the doorway of Alessandro's office, as if she had forgotten how to enter a room. He did not allow himself to panic. Panic was a luxury he could not afford in this hour. In front of this woman, he crossed to her, took both of her hands in his own, and led her to the chair opposite his desk. He did not sit behind the desk himself. He pulled a second chair around and sat directly beside her, so that when he spoke it was not down at her from a position of authority but across at her, at the same height, the way one speaks to family. Elena, listen to me. Her hands were already beginning to tremble inside his. From today, neither of you goes anywhere alone, not to the nursery, not to the grocery, not to the sidewalk in front of the building. Bruno will drive you both, or one of the men Bruno chooses, and one of them will always be within your line of sight, even when you cannot see them. If you leave a room, someone from my team will know it before you close the door behind you. This is not for 1 week. This is until I say otherwise. Alessandro, her voice caught. What does that mean? He did not answer directly. He tightened his grip on her hands. It means I am going to keep you both safe. That is what it means. That is all you need to know today. Please, please tell me. He looked at her for a long moment. He could see the shape of every question she was afraid to ask sitting behind her eyes. I will keep you safe, Elena. I promise you that. She did not cry. He was almost more frightened by that than he would have been by tears. She simply nodded, once, and let her forehead rest for a heartbeat against his shoulder, and did not lift it again for a long time. That afternoon, across the East River, in a paneled office on the top floor of a building the city had almost forgotten was there, a man in a black overcoat set down a slim manila folder in front of his employer. Inside the folder were 17 new photographs and one short handwritten sentence at the bottom of the top sheet. The sentence read, "He finally has something to lose." Vincent Romano read it twice, slowly. Then he smiled the way a man smiles at the end of a very long game of chess. That evening, Marco Bellini called an internal meeting. There were 6 men in the room. Marco, Bruno, 2 capos who had been with the family since the days of Alessandro's father, a quiet man called Enzo, who kept records no one else was allowed to touch, and Alessandro himself, at the head of a long dark table, with a single low lamp burning above him, and the rest of the room folded in shadow. Marco spread out the papers. 15 years of collisions between the De Luca and the Romano families lay on the polished wood in neat, ordered piles. Every dispute over a shipping route, every disputed contract on the docks, every stolen driver, every reassigned nightclub, every warehouse whose ownership had shifted quietly from one column to the other in the dead hours of a Sunday morning, a container hijacking off Red Hook in the 3rd year, a district attorney bought and then unbought in the 5th, 3 men killed in the 7th who had all worked, at different points in their lives, for both families and for neither of them officially, a funeral in the 9th year at which the 2 heads of the families had stood on opposite sides of a grave and had not, even once, looked at each other across it. Alessandro read every page slowly. The head of the Romano family had spent almost a decade looking for a lever he could use against Alessandro De Luca, and for almost a decade, there had been no lever to find. Alessandro had no wife. He had no children. His mother was already dead. His father was already dead. His only brother had disappeared into a monastery in Piedmont at the age of 22 and had not spoken to him in 15 years. There was, in the entire visible world, no soft place inside Alessandro De Luca's life into which a knife could be inserted. Until now, Marco did not have to say the name. Alessandro had already understood. 6 weeks ago, in the doorway of his own kitchen, with his hand against Elena's cheek, that he had, for the first time in his adult life, made himself vulnerable. He had simply not yet accepted what the vulnerability was going to cost him. Bruno spoke first, in the flat voice he used when he was already halfway to executing what he was proposing. "Boss, I am doubling the detail on both of them, effective tonight. 2 men in the car, 1 man walking behind at all times, 1 man ahead. Armored vehicle by tomorrow. I have already called Newark. They can have one ready by 6 in the morning. The nursery gets 2 of my men on the block at all times until further notice. 1 visible, 1 not. I want your consent to place a shooter in the building across the street. You have it." Marco waited until Bruno had finished. Then he leaned forward and folded his hands on the table in the way he only did when he was about to say something Alessandro would not like. "Alessandro, send them to the Hamptons." Alessandro did not answer immediately. "The house is ready. The staff has been checked personally. The grounds are walled. There is a perimeter Bruno has already inspected twice this year. Send them tonight. Elena, Mia, Rosa if you want. My cousin's wife to help send all of them out of the city. Keep them there until the Romano matter is closed. Marco, I know what you are about to say. She has waited 3 years for a life that looks like a life. Mia has been at Sunny Days for 6 weeks. She has just learned the names of the other children. If I move her now, into a house she has never seen, with people she does not know, boss." Marco's voice was very quiet. "You are counting in days now, not weeks." Alessandro looked at him across the table for a long moment. Then he closed his eyes for the length of a single breath. When he opened them again, he nodded once. "Sunday morning. I will tell her tonight. We will drive out Sunday morning together. Bruno will arrange the convoy. Sunday morning. Sunday morning, Marco." Marco held his eyes another second, then nodded and began to gather the papers. He did not say what he was thinking, which was that Sunday was 3 days away, and that 3 days was longer than he would have preferred by exactly 3 days. Alessandro left the meeting room at 11 that night. He did not go to his own bedroom. He walked instead down the long marble hallway, past the study, past the kitchen, where a single low light still burned above the sink, and stopped at the doorway of the small bright room he had had prepared 6 weeks ago for a child he had not known was living in his laundry room. Mia was asleep in her crib. She lay on her back with both arms flung above her head in the shape of a small starfish. The gray plush elephant was tucked under one arm, one of its ears pressed against her cheek. Her mouth was slightly open. Her hair had curled damply against her forehead. The rise and fall of her breathing was so small and so certain that Alessandro had to stand still for a long moment before he could remember how to breathe himself. He crossed the carpet without sound. He knelt down beside the crib. He did not touch her. "No one is going to touch you," he whispered. It was not a promise made to her. It was a promise made to the universe on her behalf, in the specific voice a man uses, when he does not yet know how much of himself he will be willing to pay to make it true. "No one. Mia, do you hear me? Not one hand. Not one." He stayed there kneeling in the dim light for a long time. Then, without quite deciding to, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. His fingers closed around a small string of dark, worn olive wood beads he had not carried in his pocket since the morning of his father's funeral almost 20 years ago. He had taken them from the desk drawer that morning without telling himself why. He held the rosary in the flat of his palm above the sleeping child and did not pray, because he did not remember how. He only breathed, and let the small, warm weight of the beads sit in his hand as if his father were standing behind him in the room, and after a long while he tucked them back into his pocket and stood up. Friday morning was ordinary. Bruno drove Elena and Mia to Sunny Days in the armored sedan that had arrived from Newark the previous afternoon. 2 men rode in a second car behind them, and a third car was already parked half a block from the nursery when they arrived. Rosa met them at the door. Mia laughed at something Rosa said in Italian and disappeared into her classroom without looking back. Elena kissed Bruno on the cheek in thanks and rode back to the penthouse in the armored sedan alone. Nothing seemed wrong. None of them, not Elena, not Bruno, not Rosa, not Alessandro standing at the tall windows of his office watching the traffic on 3rd Avenue, knew that this was the last morning of their lives that would ever be quiet. 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Alessandro was in his office with Marco, going over the final logistics for Sunday's convoy to the Hamptons. 3 cars, 2 decoys, departure at 6 in the morning, a stop for coffee at a farm stand outside Southampton that a member of Bruno's second circle had personally checked on Tuesday. The plan was almost finished. Alessandro was reaching for his espresso when his phone rang. The screen said only, "Sunny Days." He picked up on the first ring, Rosa. There was a small broken sound on the other end of the line, a sound he had never heard from her before. When she spoke, her voice was not the warm sing-song he had known for 6 weeks. It was thin. It was cracking around every word. "Mr. De Luca Alessandro, I do not know how to say this to you." He stood up. "Rosa, slowly. Tell me." Elena came at 4, as she always does. She signed Mia out. She was smiling. She had brought a small treat for the classroom. They left through the front door together. I watched them go. And then I saw Mia's little coat, the red one. She had left it on her hook, so I ran after them. I only took a moment to grab it. Rosa. When I got to the sidewalk, they were not there. The stroller was there. On its side, halfway into the street, the elephant, the little gray elephant, was in the road. Only the elephant, Alessandro. Only the elephant and the stroller. And I looked up and I looked down the block and there was no one and there was no. He heard her collapse into weeping. Behind her, in the background, a second voice, one of Bruno's men, said something urgent about the sedan. He heard the word unconscious. He heard the word bleeding. Rosa, where is Bruno? In the car, at the curb, his head. There is blood on the wheel. 2 of the men are with him now. He is breathing. Alessandro, he is breathing. But they took her. They took both of them. Alessandro did not answer. He did not sit down. He did not curse. He did not slam the receiver against the desk. He simply lowered the phone slowly from his ear, closed it in his palm, and placed it on the leather blotter. Marco was already standing. Alessandro walked out of the office. Marco followed. They took the private elevator down to the garage in absolute silence. Marco did not ask. Marco did not speak. Marco had worked at Alessandro De Luca's shoulder for 15 years, and in those 15 years he had seen his boss angry perhaps 20 times, and each of those times had been loud. He had never once seen him like this. Alessandro's face did not move. His hands did not shake. He did not blink more or less than a man who was walking to buy a newspaper. He got into the passenger seat of Marco's sedan and closed the door quietly. Marco slid behind the wheel and pulled out into the traffic on 3rd Avenue without asking where. They both already knew. There are kinds of anger inside a man that do not resemble anything the world has a name for. This is not the hot anger that makes men shout, that breaks lamps, that empties itself into the air within an hour, and leaves nothing behind but shame. This is a colder thing, a silent thing, a thing as deep as the ocean and as patient. It does not break objects, because it will not spend a single ounce of what it holds until it can spend all of it at once on the exact person who caused it. Alessandro De Luca stood on the sidewalk in front of Sunny Days that afternoon, in the low autumn light, looking down at a small gray plush elephant lying on the concrete, and understood without any word being spoken aloud that no one in the city of New York was going to sleep tonight. Rosa was on the front steps of the nursery, folded almost in half. 2 of the teachers were with her, holding her upright. When she saw Alessandro coming, she tried to stand, and her legs would not hold her, and she reached for his hand with both of her own instead. It is my fault. It is my fault. I let go of the door for 2 minutes. 2 minutes. I only went back for the little coat, Rosa. Look at me. She lifted her wet face. It is not your fault. Do you hear me? It is not your fault. Take care of the children inside. That is your work today. Leave the rest to me. She nodded, unable to speak. He crossed the sidewalk to the curb. The stroller lay on its side, one wheel still slowly turning in the small wind off the avenue. A single yellow leaf had blown into the seat, half a block down. The sedan sat crooked against the curb with its driver's door open, and 2 of Bruno's men were easing Bruno himself sideways out of the front seat. A dark line of blood ran from Bruno's hairline into the collar of his shirt. He was groaning, which was, Alessandro understood, the most beautiful sound he had heard all afternoon. Alessandro knelt on the concrete beside the stroller. The gray plush elephant lay a few feet away, on its side in the street, one soft ear folded beneath its head. Alessandro reached out and picked it up. It was slightly damp along one side where a car tire had passed through a puddle very near it. He turned it over in his hands. Along the edge of the left ear, close to the seam, there was a small dark stain no bigger than a thumbnail, a ring of drool, the mark Mia had left there the week she was cutting the second tooth, when she had gnawed on that ear for 3 days without stopping. He closed his fingers around the elephant slowly. He did not squeeze it. He simply held it, exactly as it was, in a grip that turned his knuckles white. He stood up. Marco was beside him. Marco did not speak. They walked back to the sedan together, one on each side of a small gray elephant, and Alessandro slid into the passenger seat and set the elephant on the dashboard directly in front of him, as if it were both a passenger and a promise. Marco eased the car out into traffic. They drove for 2 blocks in silence. Then Alessandro spoke for the first time since Rosa's phone call. His voice was flat and quiet and almost polite, the tone of a man ordering an espresso from a waiter he did not particularly like. Marco, find Vincent Romano for me in the next 2 hours. Marco glanced sideways. And if not, then I will find him myself. At exactly 8:10 in the evening, Alessandro's phone rang. The screen said only, unknown. He was standing at the head of the long table in the private meeting room on the top floor of the townhouse 3 blocks from the penthouse. Marco stood at his right. Bruno stood at his left, his forehead now bandaged in a neat white strip that ran under his hair, refusing every offer of a hospital, refusing every offer even of a chair. 4 of the most trusted capos of the DeLuca family stood around the table in the tense, motionless posture of men who had already understood that whatever happened tonight would define the rest of their careers. Alessandro placed the phone in the center of the table and pressed speaker. The voice on the other end came into the room like cold air through an open window. Alessandro. It was a smooth voice, older than Alessandro's own by perhaps 10 years. There was a smile audible in it, the small, private smile of a man who has waited a very long time for a particular moment and is now enjoying it in slow motion. Vincent, so you already knew. I knew this afternoon on a sidewalk. Say what you called to say, Vincent. Do not waste my time with theater. The smile in the voice widened. So many years I have looked for the crack in you, my friend. 10 years, at least. I have paid men to look. I have paid other men to look at the men who were looking. And in the end, do you know what your weakness turned out to be, Alessandro? A housekeeper and a baby. The most powerful boss on the eastern seaboard, undone by a housekeeper and a baby. I would laugh, but it would be indelicate. Alessandro did not answer. Here is what happens now. You have, in your possession, 3 specific properties. The container terminal at the foot of 23rd Street, the waterfront lot in Red Hook, the northern half of the yard in Long Island City. Together, they generate for you, by our own accountant's estimate, about $80 million a year. I would like all 3 signed over to my brother-in-law's holding company, quietly, before the close of business tomorrow. And in exchange, Alessandro, your housekeeper and your little baby come home to you in the same physical condition in which they left the nursery this afternoon. Not one bruise more, not one hair less. You have my word. And I have never gone back on my word, as you know. You have 24 hours to think about it, Alessandro. 24 exactly. I would encourage you not to be creative with the count. Alessandro let the silence hang for a moment. Around the table, no one moved. When he spoke, his voice was very quiet, and very even, and completely without heat. Vincent, listen to me carefully. I am listening, my friend. If either of them has a single scratch when I find them, one bruise on her cheek that I did not put a name to, one red mark on the child's arm from a grip that was too rough, I will personally see to it that there is not a single member of your family left on this earth old enough to carry a rifle in revenge. Not a cousin, not a nephew, not a grandson, not one. I will erase your name from the borough, Vincent, and I will start with everyone in that room with you right now. Vincent Romano laughed on the other end of the line. It was a soft, delighted laugh, the laugh of a man who had heard exactly the answer he wanted. 24 hours, Alessandro. The line went dead. For 1 full second, the room did not move. Then Alessandro straightened up from the table and turned to face his men, and every man in the room understood without being told that the meeting portion of the evening had ended. Marco, boss. Every property Vincent Romano has ever touched in the 5 boroughs, every warehouse, every restaurant, every apartment his sister has ever spent a weekend in, every empty lot the family has owned under any name for the last 10 years. I want a list on this table in 1 hour. I already have 11 names, boss. I will have more by the time we walk out. Bruno, boss, you should be in a hospital. I will go tomorrow. You will lead the search teams tonight. Split them across the 11. Quietly. No sirens, no signatures. Every place approached from at least 2 angles. If any of the 11 is right, I want the sentries neutralized before Vincent knows we have arrived. Do you understand me? Yes, boss. Then go. They went. Within 4 minutes, the room had emptied, except for the 2 men left standing on either side of the table. And after a small nod from Alessandro, Marco also left, closing the heavy door softly behind him. Alessandro walked alone through the private corridor to his office at the end of the hall. He closed the door. He locked it. He did not turn on the lamp. For 10 minutes he sat in the dim room in front of a wall that had no painting on this side of the building, and he did not move at all. He did not weep. He did not curse. He simply sat, breathing carefully, until the shaking he had not permitted himself to feel in front of his men had finished passing through his hands. Then he stood up and crossed to the small steel safe set into the paneling behind his desk. He opened it. Inside, beside the same neat rows of passports and currency that lived in every one of his safes, was a matte black pistol he had not lifted in 5 years. He took it out, checked the magazine, and set it on the desk. Behind the pistol, at the very back of the safe, was a small velvet box, the color of a very dark plum. He lifted the box out. He opened it. The silver ring of his mother lay inside on its small satin cushion. The tiny diamond caught the light from the corridor beneath the door and held it, Sharp and clear, the way a promise holds a life. Alessandro closed his fingers around the ring and held it in his palm for exactly 3 seconds. Long enough for a vow. Then he closed the box, placed it back inside the safe, and shut the door. 3 in the morning. Marco walked into Alessandro's office without knocking. He was holding a single sheet of paper. "Boss, I have it." Alessandro was already on his feet before Marco crossed the threshold. "Tell me." An abandoned warehouse on the East River, south of the Navy Yard. 2 stories. Brick, boarded windows on the ground floor. Officially derelict since 2008. Registered under a shell corporation we never had reason to look at before tonight, because it was buried under 3 layers of holding companies out of Delaware. But the corporation was reactivated 11 days ago. Small filings. Nothing that would draw attention unless a person was already looking. And in the last 2 weeks, 4 black cars have been observed entering and leaving that lot at odd hours. When yesterday, 4:15 in the afternoon, 2 vehicles arriving from the direction of Sunny Days at 4:15 exactly. A 3rd vehicle joined them at 4:30. All 3 left the site at 7. None of them have returned, which means what they delivered is still inside. Alessandro looked at Marco for one long moment. "Bruno." Marco tilted his head. Bruno was standing in the doorway behind him, bandaged and gray-skinned, but upright. "It is the place, boss," Bruno said. "I have looked at the file myself. 2 men on the corner at all times. 1 man on the roof. The pattern is not ordinary storage. The pattern is a hold site." Alessandro nodded once. He did not call the police. He would not call the police. Vincent Romano had, over 15 years, purchased his own carefully maintained rot inside the New York Police Department, and Alessandro did not know tonight which precinct was clean enough to trust with the 2 lives inside that warehouse. A phone call to the wrong lieutenant would translate, in 15 minutes, into a phone call to Vincent, and Vincent would have Elena and Mia move to a second location before the first cruiser rolled a block. He would go himself, and he would go with only the men who had bled for his father before they had bled for him. 12 of them. Marco Bellini, Bruno Ricci, who could barely stand and would not hear otherwise. Enzo, the quiet one. 2 of the old capos from the meeting room. 7 other men whose faces the city had never learned. All of them combat experienced. All of them fluent in the specific arithmetic of a night raid. All of them personally chosen by Alessandro from a shorter list of men he would have trusted with his own life. Tonight he was trusting them with something more. Bruno protested when Alessandro told him he would command the outer perimeter, not the inner assault. He lost the argument in 3 sentences. He accepted it because the boss's voice left no space for the second half of the conversation. Alessandro rode in the front passenger seat of Marco's sedan. On the dashboard, exactly where he had placed it that afternoon, sat the small gray plush elephant, one ear folded, a dark stain where a second tooth had once been cutting through. He looked at it during the whole drive across the bridge. He thought about Mia. He thought about her crying somewhere in a room she had never seen, without her mother, without her elephant, without the low Italian lullaby that had put her to sleep on his chest exactly 2 weeks ago. He thought about her small red face and her wet lashes and the way she had learned to burrow into the hollow beneath his jaw when the world got too loud. He thought about how she would not, could not, understand what was happening tonight. He thought about Elena. He thought about her hands being tied. He thought about a strip of tape across her mouth. He thought about a bruise blooming on the cheek where he had, that same morning at breakfast, laid the back of his fingers before she had left for the nursery. He thought about the fact that she did not, at this moment, know whether she would live to see morning. Marco glanced sideways at him after they had crossed the water. "Boss, are you all right?" Alessandro did not turn his head. "No, Marco, but I am not going to stop until they are." Marco did not answer. There was nothing to answer. They arrived at the perimeter at 4:15 in the morning. The warehouse squatted at the end of a broken access road, low and dark against the black river beyond it. Its brick face was streaked with old rust from a rain gutter that had been broken for a decade. Every ground floor window was boarded. Every door on this face was welded shut. Only one window on the second floor showed light, a single, dim, yellow rectangle behind a torn shade. Someone was awake on the second floor. Alessandro stepped out of the sedan without closing the door. The outer teams were already in position. Bruno's men had, over the last 40 minutes, moved into the shadows around the entire lot in a silent circle. 2 men on the roof of the abandoned building next door with rifles across their knees. 3 at the mouth of the access road, invisible from the warehouse itself. A pair on the water, holding a small dark boat under the pilings in case anyone tried to run east. No one was going into that warehouse tonight who had not been invited. And no one, more importantly, was going out. Alessandro raised one gloved hand. The circle held. He turned to his inner team of 12. Bruno had already pointed out the 2 entry points that would work: a rusted service door on the north wall and a fire ladder on the east side that led to a hallway window on the second floor. The plan was 3 prongs: 6 men through the service door, 4 men up the fire ladder, Alessandro himself and Marco through the front. Alessandro drew the matte black pistol from inside his coat. He worked around into the chamber. He pulled a pair of thin black leather gloves out of his coat pocket and tugged them on, one finger at a time. Then he looked at Marco. If I do not come back out of there, Marco, boss, take Mia, find a good family, not one of ours, a quiet one, somewhere upstate, somewhere clean. Do not let her grow up inside this world of ours. Do you hear me? Not one day of it. Marco's throat moved. Yes, boss. Swear it to me. On my father, boss. I swear it. Alessandro looked at him a second longer, then he nodded once, and turned toward the dark warehouse by the river, and stepped forward into the last hour of the life he had known. Alessandro's teams entered the warehouse from 3 directions at exactly the same second. The service door on the north wall gave way to a single, controlled shove. The window at the top of the fire ladder came open on well-oiled hinges Bruno's men had, from the ladder itself, tested 3 minutes earlier. The front, where Alessandro and Marco walked in first, opened by way of a small charge on the deadbolt that made a sound no louder than a book falling from a low shelf. The first shot came from the shadow of a forklift on the ground floor. The first shot missed. The second shot came from Marco. The second shot did not miss. The 2 men Vincent Romano had left on the ground floor did not have time to lift their radios. They fell where they had been standing, in the narrow space between the forklift and the wall, and one of Alessandro's men crossed to them without a word to make sure they would not stand again. The air inside the warehouse smelled of dust and cold river water and gun oil. Alessandro did not stop. He walked directly across the ground floor toward the concrete stairs at the back, his pistol raised, his breathing shallow and even. Around him, his men fanned out in the drilled silence of men who had done this before, sweeping corners, checking blind spots, calling nothing above a whisper. From the floor above there came the sound of 2 more shots. The team from the fire ladder, engaging the man Bruno had guessed would be posted at the top of the stairs, and then silence. He took the stairs 3 at a time. The corridor on the second floor was narrow and unlit, except for a thin line of yellow light coming from beneath the last door on the right. That door was steel, heavier than any of the others. Fitted with a padlock on the outside, Alessandro reached it in 10 seconds. He did not waste a bullet on the lock. He kicked the door once, low and hard. At the point where the padlock met the frame, the bolt held. He kicked it a second time. The hinges tore out of the wood. The door fell inward. The first thing he saw was Elena. She was tied to a straight-backed wooden chair in the middle of the room. Her wrists were bound to the arms of the chair with plastic zip ties. Her ankles were bound to its legs. A single strip of silver tape had been pressed across her mouth. Her hair had come loose and was falling into her eyes. There was a dark bruise, already purpling, high on her left cheek where a hand had struck her. She had been crying. He could see the tracks of it on both sides of her face, but her eyes, when they found his, were not the eyes of a woman weeping for herself. They were wild in a way he had never seen them, and they were not fixed on him. They were fixed on the far corner of the room. He followed them. In the far corner, on a folded blanket, sat the stroller they had abandoned 6 weeks ago in favor of Mia's small, proud walk. Mia was in it. She was awake. She was clutching, with both small fists at once, a folded gray sweater, Elena's, the one she had been wearing over her uniform that afternoon. Her small face was streaked and wet. She was not screaming. She had gone past screaming an hour ago. She was making a low, exhausted, hiccuping sob into the sweater, the sob of a baby who has been crying for someone who never came and has begun to believe that no one ever will. Then she saw Alessandro in the doorway. Her sob stopped mid-breath. He crossed the room in 5 long strides. He knelt beside Elena's chair. He drew the small folding knife from the inside pocket of his coat and cut through the zip ties one at a time. Right wrist, right ankle, left ankle with the surgical care of a man who could not afford a slip. He peeled the tape gently from her mouth. She gasped, once, as if the air belonged to a different room than the one she had been sitting in. He pulled her into his arms. "I am sorry, Elena. I am so sorry. I am sorry I let this happen. I am sorry you were alone in this room for 1 minute." She clung to the front of his shirt with both hands and could not seem to make her fingers unclench. "Mia," she whispered against his throat. Her voice was raw. "Mia first, please. Get Mia first. He rose. He crossed the room to the stroller. He lifted Mia out of it with hands that shook for the first time all evening, and the moment her weight settled against his chest, she stopped crying entirely. She pressed her small hot face into the hollow beneath his jaw. She fastened one tiny fist into the fabric of his coat exactly where she had fastened it into the silk of his tie in his marble hallway 6 weeks ago, as if this were the most natural place in the world for her to be, as if she had not just spent 7 hours in a room she did not understand with a man she did not know. She let out one long, shuddering breath against his neck, and then she was quiet. Behind him, Elena had managed to stand. She was 1 step away from him already, reaching for both of them at once. Then there was a small sound behind him, the soft, deliberate scrape of a shoe on concrete just inside the doorway. Alessandro turned very slowly, still holding Mia against his chest, one arm curved protectively around her small back. Vincent Romano stood in the frame of the broken door. He was older than Alessandro had remembered. His hair was more silver at the temples. He was wearing a long, dark overcoat that had cost more than a car, and in his right hand he was holding a chrome revolver, and he was smiling. "You came faster than I thought you would, Alessandro." He raised the revolver. "But you came only to die beside them." Vincent Romano raised the revolver. Alessandro did not think. He did not calculate. There was no interval between the movement of the gun and the movement of his own body. He pulled Mia hard against his chest with his left arm, turned his own shoulder into the line of the barrel, and stepped in front of Elena at the same time, using his own body to make a wall between the muzzle and the 2 people behind it. Vincent pulled the trigger. The sound of the shot in that concrete room was enormous, a single flat crack that seemed to strike the walls before it struck flesh. The bullet punched into Alessandro's left shoulder just below the collarbone. He staggered 1 step, only one, but he did not go down. His left arm did not release the baby. It would not have released her if he had been dead. His right hand came up, holding the matte black pistol, and he fired back. He was already firing when the second sound came from behind Vincent, the low, controlled burst of Marco Bellini's weapon from the corridor beyond the broken door, emptying an entire magazine in a horizontal line across Vincent Romano's back at close range. Vincent Romano did not have time to understand that he was dying. He fell forward into the room in a single soft collapse, the revolver clattering out of his hand and skidding across the concrete floor until it came to rest against the leg of the empty chair where Elena had been tied. His overcoat pooled around him. He did not move again. Alessandro sank to his knees. The room went briefly very quiet, or perhaps his ears did. He could hear his own breathing very close, very ragged, and beneath it Mia's small live weight against his chest, still not crying, and beyond both of those a warm, spreading wet along his ribs that he understood without looking at it. His white shirt was already darker than it had been 10 seconds ago. It was becoming darker very quickly. Elena screamed his name. She was at his side in an instant, on her knees on the concrete, her hands hovering over the wound as if not knowing where to touch first without making it worse. "No, no, 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 Elena." His voice was calm. He needed it to be calm, because there was one thing that had to happen before anything else, and he could not afford for either of them to argue with him. "Take her." He held Mia out to her mother with the arm that still worked. Elena took her without breathing. Mia went into her mother's arms in one small, warm motion and buried her face immediately in the curve of Elena's neck, as if she had known the whole time exactly where she belonged and had only been waiting for the room to be right. "Get out of this room, Elena. Get her out of this building. Now. Alessandro, now." Marco was already inside the room. Bruno came through the broken doorway a second after him, bandaged head and all, and dropped to one knee beside Alessandro without ceremony. His hand pressed hard over the wound in the shoulder. "I have him, boss. I have him." Around them, the De Luca men were moving through the warehouse in the fast, silent efficiency of a well-practiced end. Alessandro heard, from somewhere below, Marco give a single quiet order, burn it, and understood without needing to see that the warehouse would not be standing to answer any question by morning. Vincent Romano would leave the earth as a body that had never been found in a building that had never existed. Bruno half lifted, half walked Alessandro out of the room. Elena went ahead of them, with Mia pressed tight against her, one of Alessandro's men on either side of her, moving down the corridor, down the stairs, out through the front where the black sedans were waiting. By the time the first small red curl of flame began to move along the base of the ground floor wall, they were already outside. The ambulance that met them at the head of the access road was one of theirs. The driver was one of theirs. The paramedic in the back was one of theirs. Alessandro was on the stretcher before he had fully registered the transition from concrete to gurney. Elena climbed in beside him without asking. Mia still in her arms. Alessandro reached across with the arm that still worked and found her hand. He tried, weakly, to smile. "I am sorry, Elena. Do not talk. I am sorry I cannot make dinner tonight." She let out a sound that was half a laugh and half a sob and pressed her forehead against his, her tears falling into the neck of his ruined shirt. "Do not talk. Do not talk. Do not you dare die on me, Alessandro. Do you hear me? You promised. You promised me." Alessandro De Luca had spent his life fighting to protect an empire. He had killed for territory. He had killed for money. He had killed to keep the honor of a name that had been carved onto the front of a stone building in Brooklyn in 1942. He had believed, for most of 40 years, that this was what a man did with his hours on the earth. But tonight, for the first time in his life, he lay bleeding in the back of a small white ambulance for a reason that had nothing to do with any of that. He was not fighting to protect what he owned. He was fighting to protect the two people he loved. And perhaps, in the small, quiet space between one uneven breath and the next, it was the first time in 40 years that he had truly understood why a man walks through this world at all. The paramedic was cutting the ruined shirt away from his shoulder. The siren above them had not been switched on, and would not be, because no one in this ambulance wanted attention drawn to it tonight. Alessandro's hand, without his telling it to, moved slowly to the inside pocket of his coat. His fingers closed around a small string of dark, worn olive wood beads he had begun carrying again 3 days ago. He held his father's rosary tight in the flat of his palm, and he thought, quite clearly, of the ring waiting in the safe. Then the darkness came up under him from beneath the stretcher and pulled him gently down. 72 hours. Alessandro De Luca lay in a private recovery room on the 14th floor of a hospital that had, for reasons never printed on any of its brochures, always found a way to make an entire wing available to the De Luca family within an hour of a phone call. Dr. Enrico Falconi, an old friend of Alessandro's father from the days when men still made friends over long tables in Little Italy, had performed the surgery himself. The bullet had passed through the top of the left lung. Blood loss had been serious. There had been one long minute, on the table just before dawn, during which the monitor had done a thing Enrico Falconi did not tell anyone about afterward. Then the line had come back, and stayed back, and by the time the sun was fully up, the surgeon had walked out into the corridor, sat down on a plastic chair beside Marco Bellini, and said quietly, "He will live." Elena did not leave the room. She did not leave it once in 72 hours. Marco brought her a change of clothes on the second morning, folded neatly inside a paper bag, and Rosa's number on a small card. Rosa had already taken Mia to a suite in a quiet hotel 3 blocks from the hospital, arranged by Marco himself, where 2 of Bruno's cleanest men stood outside the door in shifts around the clock. Rosa sent photographs to Elena's phone twice a day. Mia eating applesauce, Mia laughing at a pigeon on the windowsill, Mia asleep on the hotel bed with the plush gray elephant tucked under one arm, its gray fur cleaner than it had been in weeks, because Rosa had washed it by hand in the hotel sink. Bruno, his own head still bandaged, stood outside the recovery room door for most of those 72 hours. He did not ask to come in. His post was the corridor. No one who did not carry a badge Marco had personally approved that morning was permitted to cross into the wing. A nurse who tried to enter on the second afternoon without her badge on the correct lanyard was politely, firmly turned around by a man twice her size, and returned 3 minutes later with the badge in the correct place. On the second night, Elena finally fell asleep in the chair beside the bed. She had not meant to. She had been holding Alessandro's hand for 11 hours straight, and she had stopped, without noticing, being able to keep her eyes open. She slid sideways in the chair, her forehead coming to rest against the edge of the bed, her hand never once losing its grip on his. She was still holding it in the morning, when he opened his eyes for the first time. The light in the room was gray and gentle. It came in through a slatted blind on the far wall in soft horizontal bars. He was aware first of the ceiling, then of a distant, very quiet beeping. Then, slowly, of a warmth around his right hand. He turned his head. Elena was there. Her hair was tangled from 3 days of not being brushed. There were shadows beneath her eyes as dark as bruises. She was still wearing the soft cream cardigan he had lent her weeks ago on the morning she had first slept in his apartment. There was a small brown stain of dried tea on the sleeve. Her cheek was pressed against the mattress. She was the most beautiful thing Alessandro De Luca had ever seen in his life. Her eyes opened at the same instant, as if she had felt him look at her. For a heartbeat she did not understand what she was seeing. Then she did. Alessandro. The word tore out of her. Alessandro. Alessandro. She was up out of the chair without letting go of his hand. She kissed his knuckles. She kissed the back of his hand. She kissed the inside of his wrist. She kissed his forehead and both of his cheeks and then his forehead again, and she was crying so hard that she could not stop. And she did not stop apologizing for the crying, which made her cry more. He tried to speak. It came out as a hoarse, uneven scrape. Mia. Elena laughed and sobbed at the same time and pressed her wet face against his hand. She is perfect. She is perfect, Alessandro. She is at the hotel with Rosa, 3 blocks away. She has not been out of Rosa's sight for 1 minute. She ate applesauce today. She waved at a pigeon this morning. She is waiting for you to come home. She has been waiting. He closed his eyes for a second. When he opened them again, they were wet. Slowly, with the arm that had not been wounded, he lifted his hand from beneath hers and turned it over so the palm faced up. In the flat of it lay a small string of dark, worn olive wood beads, the rosary of his father. A nurse had taken it from the inside pocket of his ruined coat when they had cut the shirt off him in the ambulance bay. She had given it, without a word, to Elena, and Elena had carried it in her own hand for 3 days without setting it down. She had placed it back in his palm sometime during the night, so that if he woke, he would find it there first. He closed his fingers around it. His grip was weak. It held. He looked at Elena for a long, quiet moment. He looked at her the way a man looks when he has been given, without deserving it, an extra piece of his own life. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and very close to breaking. I spent 38 years believing I still had plenty of time, Elena. She held her breath. I am not spending 1 more day of it that way. She lowered her forehead to his and closed her eyes and did not answer, because there was nothing to answer. There was only the small, uneven rhythm of their breathing coming together at last in the same room. Outside the window, the sun was rising above the East River, laying long gold across the water for the first time in 3 mornings. 3 blocks north, in a quiet hotel room on the 5th floor of a building the city did not particularly notice, a small, dark-haired baby was sleeping peacefully on the corner of a Maid bed. One small fist closed around the ear of a freshly washed gray plush elephant, waiting for the morning she would be brought home. 3 weeks later, Alessandro De Luca came home. The shoulder was still bandaged beneath his shirt. He could not lift his left arm above his heart. The private car from the hospital pulled into the garage at 4 in the afternoon, and Marco walked him personally to the elevator, one steady hand under his good arm the whole way, and did not let go until the elevator doors began to close. Boss. Marco. Welcome home. The elevator rose. Elena was waiting for him at the door of the penthouse. She had opened it before he had even keyed the panel. She was wearing a soft, dark blue dress he had never seen before, and her hair was down, and she had been crying already, and she was smiling. He stepped over the threshold onto the marble. From somewhere behind Elena, in the direction of the kitchen, came a small, joyful shriek, then the unmistakable sound of small palms slapping the tray of a high chair, and a new sound Alessandro had never heard before, a sound that had been learned, painstakingly, over 3 weeks in a hotel room while he was in a hospital bed, a single, small, delighted word. Papa. Alessandro stopped where he was, in the middle of the marble hallway. He stood there for a long moment beneath the crystal chandelier, on the exact patch of polished stone where, months ago, a baby he had never met had crawled toward him and lifted both her arms and asked, without knowing what she was asking, to be picked up, and Alessandro De Luca, the man the underworld of 2 boroughs had spent 20 years learning not to look in the eye, began to cry. He cried without covering his face. He cried without turning away. He cried the way a grown man cries when he has, at long last, been given permission to feel a thing he did not know he had spent 40 years refusing. Elena crossed to him without a word. She slid one arm carefully around his uninjured side, tucked her face against his neck, and simply held him there in the middle of the hallway until he could breathe again. Then she took his good hand and led him toward the kitchen. The marble table had been set for 3, not with any of the plain, everyday things, with the good china that had lived in a cupboard for 6 years without ever being lifted down, with cloth napkins folded into small, precise triangles, with a low ceramic bowl of fresh flowers in the very center, white and cream and one single stem of pale pink, 3 chairs, 3 places, and in the middle place, in the tall new high chair, Mia in a small yellow dress, her hair brushed into 2 tiny tufts, her plush gray elephant tucked into the crook of her arm, hammered her plastic spoon against the tray at the sight of him, and laughed and shouted her new word again. Papa, papa, papa. They ate together slowly. It was a simple meal. Elena had made it herself. Roast chicken, potatoes with rosemary, bread torn from a warm loaf. Alessandro ate one-handed. Elena cut his food for him without being asked. Mia banged her spoon between bites and offered Alessandro small, dripping fistfuls of mashed potato, which he accepted every time, on his tongue, without flinching, as if she were feeding him a sacrament. When the plates were cleared, when Mia had been wiped down and given a piece of soft bread to gnaw on, Alessandro reached into the inner pocket of his jacket with his good hand and took out a small velvet box the color of a very dark plum. Elena looked at the box. She did not move. Alessandro pushed his chair back from the table. He stood up, slowly, one hand braced against the edge of the marble for balance. Then, in front of both of them, in front of the woman who had cleaned his home for 3 years without him ever knowing her mother's name, and in front of the small child who had crawled into his life through the door he had ordered locked, he lowered himself carefully onto one knee, on his own kitchen floor, and he did not care that his shoulder screamed at him for it. Elena Rossi. She had already begun to cry. For 38 years I believed I had been put on this earth to rule an empire. 3 months ago, a very small person crawled into my hallway and taught me, in the space of 90 days, that I had been put on this earth